I think I'm really starting to understand why people post videos that are so controversial or talk about controversial things and talk about things with a lot of emotionality. And I think that it's simply because it's a lot easier to talk about something that you feel passionate about than it is to talk about and prepare for something that requires more cognitive load, that is a little bit less exciting at first glance. I think that's one reason that people are drawn to posting stuff like that. They use the momentum of their emotions in the moment, and that helps them post. So, posting about something that isn't super engaging at first glance is more difficult and requires more commitment to actually get the message out there because it's just not as compelling. It just doesn't feel as compelling. And you have to not only enjoy the sound of your own voice, but you also have to assume that other people do. And something that gets a lot of rage or even joy is going to be a lot more engaging to people than something that is just a thing you process. But I do want to talk about positive psychology because that's what I went to Ireland to study in 2024. I finished my dissertation in 2025 and I received my MA degree in 2026. I decided to do positive psychology instead of a master's in business administration, instead of an MBA, partially because I knew that the market is saturated with MBAs. And there's nothing against MBAs, but when I would look at the course descriptions for an MBA, it would make me want to scream. It would make me want to run away. It would make me want to hide. Like, it just wasn't compelling at all. And it wasn't until I saw this degree in positive psychology and coaching psychology that I really felt like I was breathing a sigh of relief. I was like, this is a thing. Like, human flourishing is a thing that people study. I had been for so long on the um, cluster B personality, uh, pathology, abuse psychology side of psychology. So when I saw the positive psychology, it really was just like there's hope. Like there's another way to approach how we think about the mind and how we're approaching ways to make the most of how our brains work. And sure, they're also doing that in neuroscience, but positive psychology is just this burgeoning part of psychology that I wanted to be a part of. And because it also included coaching, which is something that I was beginning to become passionate about because of my negative experiences of coaching in the corporate environment, it was just what I decided to do. So I just wanted to briefly touch on what my dissertation was about, which is workplace well-being for women of color working in Ireland. There aren't a lot of women of color in Ireland, and when I first brought the idea to the person who would become my supervisor, the uh, the conversation was unexpected. So obviously, if you haven't been able to tell from my accent, I'm a US citizen. I was born in the US. I lived in the US until I was 20. So my experience of the world and a lot of my work experience has been based in the US. And so that really is the lens through which I see how women of color are seen, treated, promoted in the workplace. And when I brought this idea to the supervisor, she's great. I just don't want to implicate her too much because I know, like, in future videos, I'm probably going to talk about things that are kind of controversial, and she has nothing to do. Like, this is, disclaimer, disclaimer from my work, my place of work, disclaimer for my supervisor, even disclaimer for the universities that I've gone to. Like, these are my opinions, but this is my experience and I'm sharing it with you. But what she told me is, because I first wanted to focus on managers and leaders in corporate environments and how they deal with and support their women of color workers. And she said to me, it is possible that you will not find a lot of managers who have managed women of color. And I was like, when I'm walking around in Cork, when I was walking around in Dublin, I fucking saw women of color. I saw them. Um, they must work somewhere. So if women of color weren't going, I couldn't understand what she was saying. What does it mean? What does that mean? That women of color aren't working in corporate spaces, like their numbers are so few. Um, it was just a lot to process. Like that right there was telling me, it was like almost like a red flag that with my US American lens, I was going to be seeing things that didn't make sense to me and that were showing systemic discrimination in ways that I would have a hard time processing. So that's why I ended up studying. I had to intersect it with positive psychology. So when my dissertation research really took form, it became the effects of a positive psychology intervention on women of color and their workplace well-being experience living in Ireland, working in Ireland. So I ended up interviewing a handful of women of color. There are so many reasons why. One reason is LinkedIn throttles anything about women and women of color. And that's the primary place that I was recruiting from. I was posting on LinkedIn and asking others to help me spread the word on LinkedIn about this study. So that already was not working in my favor. Another thing that I discovered is that women of color is not exactly a unanimously universal way of describing women who are not white in Ireland. Black women in Ireland have multiple ways that they describe themselves. Asian women, Southeast Asian women, Indian women, Iranian women, like any woman who is non-white, non-Irish, or any woman who is non-white and Irish, these intersections and these different identities come to Ireland without a uniquely accepted way of describing them. So even using the phrase women of color was going to be off-putting for some of my potential participants. So it is possible that even in the initial recruiting stage, in the survey that I used that said, do you identify as a woman of color? In my American lens, and from an American perspective, a US American perspective, women of color or woman of color is anyone who is not white, essentially. In Ireland, that is, again, not a blanket way of describing people. There isn't one yet. So it could have just meant that some people were saying, I don't identify as a woman of color, and so that they were, eliminated from the survey results in a way that wasn't satisfactory for me or for them, but it was a legitimate reason for them to opt out of the study. So that one factor, identity, really started to come into play right away. Another thing that was interesting in my research, and I'll talk about it again in other videos, is in order to even have the resilience to work in a workplace that doesn't welcome and accept all of you and doesn't understand how to welcome and accept all of you, including your ancestral identity, you're never going to feel psychologically safe. And it's not the same feeling of being psychologically unsafe as it would be in the United States because of the unique experience of discrimination, the history of chattel slavery in this country, the unfortunate ways that different oppressed groups have been pitted against each other for different nefarious purposes. It's not that same kind of feeling of psychological unsafety. It's not necessarily an existential threat in the physical sense, in the sense that your freedom is not guaranteed. But in terms of, is it safe for me to be who I am? Do you even see me? Do you recognize me for who I am? Would you, outside of these four walls of this place we call our company, would you still treat me with the same respect, the same acknowledgement of who I am, and all of what that entails if I didn't work with you? And even if you wouldn't, setting that aside, do you see me as a full person capable of everything that you're capable of, whether or not I was born here? Do you see me in that way, so that I can let my guard down enough to feel like a human here, like a full human, the same way that you think of yourself, a native Irish person, as a full human? And if you don't have any curiosity about me, about my experience of your country, or perhaps of the country that we both share, that we both grew up in, if you don't have that same level of positive regard for me that you would for an Irish person, a white Irish person who was born and raised in Ireland, what does that mean for our relationship and how I can move through this company, how I will be supported, how you will see me, how you will promote me, how you will treat me, how you'll let others treat me? That's what's at stake for workplace well-being for women of color in Ireland. And there was a lot that I learned in that study. And there's a lot more that could have been pulled from that study, even though I only ended up speaking to 6 women for all kinds of reasons. I still think that there's so much more that could have been pulled from the data that I got. And just quickly to explain what kind of data I collected, if it's interesting to you, I did both qualitative and quantitative, which means there was a survey based on very specific questions that gauged PERMA, and PERMA is the model of positive psychology that measures different types of kind of dimensions of well-being. So there's positive emotions, there's engagement, there's motivation, there's relationships. I'm not saying it in the right order. And then there's accomplishment. So it's PERMA. And then that kind of got extended into like health and vitality. So there's some questions that measure that. And then like, how do you feel? Like just say whether or not you feel like you have well-being. So that was the quantitative part of it. And then the qualitative part was the interviews, and then also the journaling. So There is a mixed methods study, and so part of the reason that I chose mixed methods is because, again, this is kind of like all related, but there just wasn't a lot of data. There wasn't a lot of data on women of color in Ireland. There wasn't a lot of data on their experience of work. There wasn't anything, zero research papers published about positive psychology in the context of women of color's experience in Ireland. Um, and then the intersection of workplace well-being and positive psychology and women of color in Ireland, 000. So I just made a really ambitious attempt to try to get a lot of that data in one go. And part of it was because I just thought it was a respectful thing to do, because we're talking about people who are severely underrepresented. And then another reason is just women of color's experience in Ireland is multidimensional. It is, it has depth, it has breadth. It's not just something that you can pinpoint in one question or one survey. So in another way, it was a way of respecting them and the fullness of their experience and giving them a place to talk about it. So I felt like there needed to be multiple entries of data just to make that exist. And that's probably another reason why I didn't get a lot of people in this study, because they were like, this is too much. There's too many questions. There's too many things you're asking me to do. No, thank you. And that's fine. But the 6 women who stuck it out, amazing, incredible, 10/10. I respect every one of them. I learned a lot from them, and they're going through it. Whether or not their PERMA results showed that they had a change in their well-being, whether or not their interview data showed that they overall feel good, there are still things that make it stressful and anxiety inducing to be an only in a workplace. If you're the only Asian, if you're the only person of African descent, it's going to be harder for you in the workplace. And that's reflected in the data. So what does that have to do with coaching? It informs the way I coach. What does it have to do with positive psychology? It informs the way positive psychology can be improved, because at the bottom line, and kind of like a very brief summary of some of the data, women of color are already doing so many things that positive psychology sees as like this great revelation of how to be well in the world. They're already doing it because it's a survival. It's a survival tactic. It's a way to feel good even when the world does not care about you or think about you or acknowledge your existence. And so, like, the intrinsic positive psychology, the natural, just like coming out of them as people, their existence exuding positive psychology components and flourishing against all odds, like a flower growing out of concrete in a sidewalk. That's what was happening. That's what I saw. And I think depending on who you are, the reflexivity is just part of the way that you will digest and process the research. But that is the way that I interpreted it, and I will talk more about it in another video. So that's a little bit about me and some of the most recent experiences that I have had in Ireland and with my research. And I'll talk more about that in another video. Thanks for watching.